Hi, I'm Mark Turner, External Relations Director at SRM 360, and welcome to our live discussion on how the first decade of solar geoengineering, were it ever to happen, also known as sunlight reflection methods or SRM, might unfold. We'll be covering how SRM might start, under what circumstances, what kind of challenges and crises might be faced in early stages of deployment, and what could be done now potentially to reduce the risk of things going wrong. Note that our focus here is on the early days, the first 10 years. We can explore longer term risks in other sessions. So our goal at SRM 360 is to support an informed discussion about SRM. We don't take a position on whether or not it should ever be deployed, but we do support its research and broad-based discussions on the way forwards. We'll be fielding questions from the audience. Please ask them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as we go along, not the chat, but the dedicated Q&A option so we can keep track. And please keep your questions short and focused on the topic at hand. Linus Baselius, our Research and Writing Associate, will direct these questions to the panel members at the end. So thank you again, and I hope you enjoy this discussion. So joining us today is Holly Buck, Associate Professor at the University of Buffalo. She's an environmental social scientist, and her research focuses on public engagement with emerging climate technologies. She holds a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University and authored the 2019 book, After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration. Ted Parson is a professor and faculty director at UCLA. He holds degrees in physics, management science, and public policy, and has served on advisory committees for the US National Academy of Sciences and consulted for the White House, US Congress, and Canadian government, amongst others. And Cynthia Scharf, senior fellow at the Center for Future Generations, a European think tank, is leading their work on climate intervention technologies. She was senior strategy director for the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative and served in the Office of the UN Secretary General as the head of strategic climate communications and chief speechwriter on climate change. So thank you, Holly, Ted, and Cynthia, so much for joining us. In this discussion, we'll focus on the most researched approach to SRM, stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. There are different ideas about what this might look like in practice, but these commonly include deploying a fleet of specially designed aircraft to release tiny reflective particles into the upper atmosphere. The idea is that these could reflect a small fraction of sunlight back into space, cooling the planet. Scientists suggest that this could reduce many impacts from global warming, but would also introduce a whole set of new risks, both physical and geopolitical. To be clear, SRM is not being deployed today and is mostly being studied in computer models along with a small number of small outdoor experiments. The ideas we are discussing today are hypothetical, and the future is notoriously difficult to predict. But research is increasing, decisions are already being taken which could have implications for generations. So before I turn to our panelists, I'd just like to open with a quick question to our audience, which should pop up on your screens. Given the current climate trends, how likely is it that SAI would be deployed this century? So if we give you 10, 15 seconds to answer that, it'll be interesting to see where our audience stands on this. And the poll suggests more than half think it is very likely, and more than 80% of our respondents think it is either very or somewhat likely. That's a pretty striking response there. So thank you. So let's start with the context. What does this world look like? Let's imagine a world sometime this century in which an actor or group of actors decides to deploy SAI. What kind of conditions might have led to this decision, and what might this world look like? Cynthia, tell me about the environmental and geopolitical conditions of this world. Can you suggest some of the circumstances in which a decision to deploy might be made?
Sure. This is conjecture, of course. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I think we're going to see a much more fractured world in terms of geopolitical rivalries, and also in terms of a common feeling of truth. What is truth? Is it fungible? Are facts fungible? Who's truth? So you're having a multiplicity of narratives that might be surrounding how one thinks about this issue. Climate change, I think, will be the pretext, the rationale for a potential deployment. But I suspect it won't be the only reason. And I say that based on some experience we just recently completed at our think tank, doing 42 hours of simulated negotiations on SRM. Could we reach agreement on a research, on testing, or deployment? These were 20 actors in the room representing various countries and constituencies. After those 42 hours, we did not come to an agreement on anything. And most importantly, I found in terms of thinking about precipitating factors, the science dropped out of the conversation within the very first few hours. Even when we let participants know that there was a computer simulation available to participants to actually map what some of the scenarios might be, no one asked for that simulation. So it was quite a striking response that the science, while the pretext, it was very much about geopolitical sovereignty and rivalry.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thanks, Cynthia. Ted, in this world where actors are deciding to deploy SRM, what might the state of international governance look like? For example, how influential might the UN be, or other forms of international cooperation?
Um, Thank you. More speculation, and also my thanks for the invitation to join. Um, this question interacts really tightly with the question of when it occurs. I mean, if someone chooses to deploy or begin steps toward deployment in the near term, then you'd expect the international governance landscape to be rather similar to that today, a divided world, the United States, from its historical position of leadership in international governance, somewhere between withdrawn and malignant, middle powers, and Europe kind of maneuvering to try to develop some alternatives. In the longer term, there could be more change. You could have much more effective or much worse international governance. For specific governance regarding SRM, I think the presence or absence, we'd all love to have some rational, broadly participatory governance system at least started to be constructed in advance. But that I don't think will ultimately determine actors' decisions whether or not to deploy. So there might be more, there might not. The governance might have to be reactive. I think the biggest interaction here is that the presence of a stronger kind of normative or obligatory governance structure in advance will shape the character of deployment. It will make it more likely that if there's deployment, it's done by major powers, who care less about the pre-existing governance. It would also shape the sort of the manner in which it's done and the degree of communication and coordination. And of course, once deployment happens, then governance world is immediately turned on its head because there would be a great deal of action and rapid learning and more serious attention after than before.
Thank you. And we'll definitely get to some of those sort of scenarios of what happens after deployment starts in a moment. But Holly, if I turn to you, I mean, essentially the same kind of question. What is this world? What might the state of discourse around climate action in different countries be? What kind of level of cooperation between different groups would you imagine in this hypothetical future where SRM is being deployed?
Yeah, so I think we have to hold both the climate action context and the non-climate context at the same time. Obviously, they inform each other. With the non-climate context, I think it hinges a lot on the development of AI, the economic impacts there, what Cynthia mentioned about the status of truth. Does AI help further fracture that or find coherence? The decline of the US empire, does the corruption and looting go on to be more of a disaster, or do they find their footing and become a normal country? Broader macroeconomic trends and development trajectories more generally. So there's all of that. Then there's the climate action context. Some of the things I'd be looking at are one, the cost and effectiveness of adaptation as we move further into climate impacts. Two, does phase out really become a frame, as some efforts in the recent conference indicated, and geoengineering becomes part of the phase out discussion as a point of negotiation, perhaps? And third, does overshoot become a frame for mitigation and a storyline for climate action, or does that stay more in the kind of very academic realm? does it break through to popular culture? I don't know, but those are the kind of discursive elements I'd be watching in terms of the climate action context. And I'm not really sure whether it's the climate context or the non-climate context that shapes SRM more.
Thanks. So, yeah, one way or another, this world would probably look a little different to the one we have now, but it'll be complicated. And so, within this different world, one could imagine a couple of broad ways in which SRM might be deployed. One more cooperatively, with some sort of system around it, and one less cooperatively or in a more adversarial way. So we'll have a look at both of those in turn and see how the risks might differ and what the challenges might be in each of those cases in turn. But I just wanted to start, Ted, maybe you can help me, because sometimes there's a little confusion as to what actually is deployment. So perhaps you could help us out here. What would a deployment, what would count as a deployment? What level of stuff going into the stratosphere, and what would be needed in terms of engineering, and how far away are we from that?
Thanks. Those are all great questions. And the short answer to the last one is not nearly as far away as we all thought. It's a rapidly moving target in terms of advances in capability. There's a lot of confusion over the question of what would count as deployment. And I think the main source of the confusion is that people confuse scale and purpose. A lot of the debate about research versus deployment assumes that research is small and deployment is big. And that is certainly true if you're speaking about research that has been done and is currently proposed. There's a vast difference in scale between that and anything that would make an observable change in climate. But really, what deployment means is something done for some other purpose, some operational purpose, rather than to advance knowledge. So there can be big research, and indeed there are some research questions about the impacts of SRM that would require big interventions, such as characterizing the global scale climate response. And there can be small deployment done for other purposes. It's sort of a silly example, but there's this little two-person firm in the United States called Make Sunsets that there's been a great deal of noise about. They are releasing like less than a kilogram in weather balloons, and they're selling cooling credits online. That's an operational commercial purpose. It's deployment. It's just trivially tiny micro deployment. So the crucial boundary isn't research versus deployment, it's the scale of intervention and its expected impact. And you can think about this in physical terms or in social and political terms, and they're both diffuse, uncertain boundaries. If you think about in physical terms, the boundary of an intervention that would make climatically meaningful effects is something like 100,000 tons a year with an aim of cooling perhaps 0.1 degree C. A determined developer and purchaser could get there in a few years, either by modifying existing aircraft, and if they're operating only at higher latitudes where you don't have to go as far up, or with new aircraft given a focused customer ready to spend a few billion. If you think about the boundary in social or political terms, the boundary is kind of what scale of effort would attract serious and perhaps hostile attention from other states, perhaps because they think it has a significant transboundary effect. That is probably much smaller, and that's really to be constructed socially and politically. It's like there's been surprising degrees of kind of uproar and objection to research interventions proposing to put in kilograms to hundreds of kilograms of material into the atmosphere. So is the boundary of social and political concern to mark it as, deployment like? Is it a ton? Is it a kiloton? One way or another, the capability space is moving so fast that basically either of these could be feasible for some actors. Obviously, the bigger ones take longer and require more actors with more resources. But we thought we'd have 10 or 20 years to develop governance, and it really looks increasingly like we might not. Governance might be reactive on its back foot, and it might be in that situation within a decade. Now, of course, or no one might do it, right? I mean, people might think and plan and so on, and it might be 20 years, and it hasn't happened. We just don't know.
And we have a poll question later on, kind of looking into. I'll see if we have time to get to it. But when people think might be a likely time frame for this to happen, were it to happen. But all right, let's start with a cooperative scenario. I guess the better of the scenarios. Whether or not it might happen. Well, you can address that as well. But let's imagine one. Cynthia, what would a broadly cooperative deployment of SAI look like? Could you lay out a scenario for us?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I can imagine a cooperative Nordic nation effort, a large-scale research effort, including outdoor testing, involving indigenous communities, involving widespread community participation, a real bottoms-up kind of effort, with the climate as the goal, not a geopolitical contest, but with saving the cryosphere or protecting the cryosphere as its goal. That, however, could easily go awry once that fine line, or that very fudgy line that Ted talked about, between testing and deployment is crossed, and a major Arctic power beyond the Nordic nations decides enough is enough and clamps it down one way or the other. So I don't have a problem imagining the research being collaborative, including Indigenous and NGOs and community participation. When it crosses that potential very fuzzy line, I can imagine there be quite stringent reactions. If I could just go into the world of the ideal for 1 minute, we are very, very far from this, but if we could wave the magic wand, and what would cooperative deployment look like, granted that no one wants to see deployment at this stage, I would imagine something where there is cooperative, collaborative, transparent research between the US and China and any other country that wanted to join the effort. Something like CERN, which is, some of you know, is in Geneva, an open scientific collaborative research effort seeking to diffuse questions of rivalry, secrecy, security, military overtones. In the best of all possible worlds, if there was to be collaboration on research, I would see that as a very important step in the right direction.
Thank you. Holly, is there anything you'd like to add to that? And perhaps you could also bring in an element of, more broadly in this more ideal, if that's the right word, cooperative scenario, how might civil society and broader publics be involved around the world?
Yeah, well, to build on what Cynthia said, I do think there's a relationship between the conditions of research and the conditions of deployment. I wrote a paper with Simon Nicholson a few years ago, published in One Earth, Solar Geoengineering Research and the Public Interest, a proposal for how to do it, where we were looking at the model of the CGIAR, these agricultural research centers, as thinking about how do you have this integrated research program in multiple locations that's coherent, and that you're really building local capacity, not both on the research that helps the deployment capacity decision making. But I mean, when it comes to the public, I think the main point I would say here is that we need to really think about public not in terms of social acceptance or social license, as is often the case, not just with geoengineering, but with other technologies more broadly, towards thinking about active social support and actual demand. I find it hard to imagine a deployment where the public is not driving the demand in some way. And if that, I think that can change the frame where we approach the relationship with the public.
Thanks. So let's imagine, even were this a more, well, Ted, actually, one other quick one, if you could jump in a more cooperative or collaborative scenario, where would you imagine international structures playing a role, international governance structures?
So I think I agree with both the thrust of both Holly's and Cynthia's remarks. It was about cooperation building when we're doing research and testing, and then considering the possibility of expanding. And I think that is both the most likely model and in the real world, kind of the most reasonably achievable model. So there's no law to limit deployment. There's no international law that limits deployment of SRM at present. So as a formal legal matter, any state could do it. And in my view, it's unlikely that there would be an authoritatively established multilateral decision process before the first step is taken. But one thing people often overlook is, like, deployment doesn't matter unless it's sustained for decades. So this is not an issue that is characterized by sudden surprises and abrupt shifts. Things look abrupt, but then there's a lot of time to react and adjust. So I think the model of governance that is likely to develop is one that is kind of iterative. A few actors do something, they do it more or less cooperatively. They invite others to join. There are some arguments. Some more people come on board. There's more arguments. So there's a kind of an adaptive or co-evolving development of what's physically being done and the structures to collectively understand and control it.
So maybe we could take, again, in this sort of more collaborative approach, which would still have risks and still bring up all sorts of challenges and tensions. Maybe, Ted, you could give us a sense, in this first 10 years, what kind of physical risks and uncertainties could arise in this cooperative deployment scenario?
Okay, I'm laughing here because I knew this one was coming, and I know I'm the closest thing to a physical scientist on this panel, but I'm really not. I'm an advanced amateur. I'm a scientist the way I'm a musician, right? You know, not that great. So I don't speak with authority, but I follow the literature. So assuming that what's being done is spraying sulfur, which is the dominant material, so sulfuric acid aerosols, that most of the research has been done, most of the natural aerosol is that. First, there's still a big uncertainty in how much you would need to distribute in order to get a given climate cooling effect. The models differ by more than a factor of 2 in how much sulfur it takes to get a given temperature effect. That uncertainty would shrink rapidly as soon as someone starts. Then the risks of doing that, they're well known from more than 50 years of research on atmospheric aerosols, and they don't much depend upon whether deployment is cooperative or non-cooperative as long as everybody's doing sulfur. By far the bigger risks are in the social and political domain. It's a very strange issue in that regard. People talk about scientific uncertainty, but the stakes of that are smaller. So impact on the stratospheric ozone layer, but small and temporary. Some acid deposition, but much smaller than what we're already doing, and the increase smaller than the decreases we're currently making. Same thing for tropospheric air pollution and respiratory illness. I should just quickly say at this point, a big wild card dropped on this debate 10 days ago. There was a big public announcement and release of 8 papers from a private firm based in Israel called Stardust that are proposing a new kind of engineered particles. They're mostly amorphous silica instead of sulfur. They say that these are much, much more benign than sulfur, no environment, health, or safety effects, more trackable. But those claims really haven't been fully established or verified yet. So this is sort of shocking big news whose implications have not been processed. It might be important, it might be good, it might not. You know, watch this space.
So in terms of the social consequences that you mentioned, Cynthia, again, in the cooperative scenario, what kind of geopolitical tensions could still emerge?
Yes, I definitely think there would be, if even in the cooperative deployment scenario. Very quickly, I think the opportunity or the mishap of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories propagating, even in a cooperative deployment or cooperative research and testing, something that might go awry, which was intended to be beneficial. I'll give you an example. Say there was a cooperative research and testing endeavor located among the Nordic countries using drones, transparent research, as much public engagement as possible. Say one of those drones crashed across a border. Would be very, very easy for someone to come and take a photograph of that drone and say, this was a deliberate act of war, or this was a deliberate provocation, it's across our borders, and something that started as cooperative spirals out of control. And here I want to give a big shout out to our team. They've been doing foresight scenario planning for the last few months, and this is one of the scenarios that came out of that experiment. I also think that there would be reverberations in terms of geopolitics. That's an obvious one. Societal impacts as well. I think the shock waves would be quite strong, even if it were cooperative, that we've kind of crossed a line somewhere as a species and we're entering a new world. I think that psychological ramification would play out for quite some time.
Holly, building on some of what Cynthia just raised, I'd love your thoughts also on how do different groups know what's going on? Who do they trust to tell them what's going on? What kind of information sources might they turn to? How do you handle this kind of messy information environment, even in a cooperative situation?
Yeah, so first I'll say something about the status quo right now, which is that most people get their news from social media. There's a lot of polling on that. Right now, people are uncertain about what's happening in the air above them. We did a survey in the US. This was published in 2025, where we asked people, is it true or false that the US government is currently operating a program that uses airplanes to put chemicals into the air to counteract global warming? Half of respondents were unsure. Only about 30% would say that was false. So right now there's large uncertainty, and I think we need to think about this in the context of environmental monitoring more broadly. We need massive investments in monitoring for air quality, for water. People are nervous about things they can't see, like PFAS, rightly so. We just haven't been investing in the kind of capabilities that we could have in terms of just helping people be oriented what's going on around them more generally. And I think that relationship needs to be repaired and those investments need to be made. And that would benefit SAI too, eventually, if it ever happened. But it's kind of a first order concern, the monitoring infrastructure.
Well, let's definitely talk about that a little bit in the last section of the kind of things we should be doing now to reduce the risk. I'd love to dig more into that, Holly. But let's talk now about, I mean, it sounds risky enough even in a cooperative scenario. What about a non-cooperative or adversarial scenario? What, how likely might that be, and what might that look like? Cynthia, can you give me a sense, sketch out some of the possibilities of adversarial deployment?
Sure. I think most people on this call would probably already have this in their minds, but some kind of geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. Russia's a little bit of a wild card on this one, but the competition for economic superiority, perhaps for technological superiority, might drive a decision toward deployment that the pretext would be climate impacts or some kind of science-based concern. But the real reason would be to define a new landscape, a weather sovereignty. I've heard that term used just very recently in some kind of publications coming out of Washington, or atmospheric sovereignty or cloud sovereignty. It's a struggle for geopolitical dominance by other means. And I think if we continue down the road that we're currently on, with one superpower denying that science has any legitimacy whatsoever, and the other moving ahead quite quickly without much public oversight on emerging technologies, that could actually lead us down this road, which is quite scary. There also could be unattended consequences that trigger a conflict. Again, potentially a testing that was seen as cooperative and benign. Something happens and it's instead, because of misinformation or twisted information, perceived as something else. That could generate fake news, and suddenly you have a spiral where something that was started with peaceful intent is seen by the public in a very different way. And we are very quickly losing control over narratives of those kinds of global issues, COVID being obviously just one example.
So Holly, maybe you could come in and add on that. So also beyond states, what kind of other actors do you imagine being involved in this non-cooperative scenario? And maybe you could just sort of sketch out a potential, how does it go? Somebody deploys, what happens in the first year, what happens in the second year? Do you have any thoughts on different ways in which that might play out in the relatively early days?
Well, I think you can imagine a scenario that's not necessarily adversarial, but where things are led by a corporate actor that's trying to provide critical infrastructure. And I think one of the analogies here might be Starlink, where people, living in remote landscapes. I was interviewing people in Alaska who brought this up. They were like, Starlink's basically our only option. We're glad about it, but we're also not jazzed about relying on one of Elon Musk's companies for this service. And there's a lot of ambiguity there. And, some of them wish that they had broadband or another option, right? So I think we could imagine a scenario where there's a private company that decides to provide this service and people are just kind of stuck or locked in. And in terms of how that happens over time, I think people are wary, but if they feel like they have no alternative, that's how you get there. And some people will adjust, some people won't. I don't know.
In this situation, Ted, would even in a situation where people aren't doing this cooperatively, not doing it under sort of traditional or governance structures within the UN, what kind of international law would still apply? Is there something still holding this scenario together? Are there other kind of forms of governance that constrain actors in a non-cooperative or even adversarial scenario?
Nothing in the strong way that you've suggested. So there are some customary international law principles that could be invoked by some countries to say, as a basis to say, oh, you shouldn't do that. But as a practical matter, deployment will be constrained by capabilities, by geopolitical interactions among the major powers and those proposing to do it. So I think I want to sort of reaffirm and underscore one of the points that Cynthia made, in that the introduction of rivalry and the risks of rivalry in this space aren't so much directly about competing deployments. There's been a lot of speculation about, if one country tries to geoengineer, would another try to counter geoengineer? Those scenarios are mostly implausible, except for I've been able to come up with two particular cases. One is if there's great alarm about climate change and one group starts to deploy SAI, but it does so in a very slow, careful, and measured way because they're very precautionary, and there's another group that is more alarmed and wants faster action, then that might be within their capability space to basically add to the first. And so you get what the actors who want the most want. There's also very, very limited room for what there's been a lot of speculation about, regionally rivalrous deployment, where some group tries to deploy in a way that they steer the benefits more to one region than another. The Earth system and the technology don't allow much of that. So the more active and I think more dangerous forms of rivalry or conflict around it are about other stuff. It's like if a group starts and some major powers really hate it, what might they do? Well, that is an elevation of an already high level of generalized conflict and rivalry, and states have all kinds of tools to do that. Advanced governance is likely to be of limited help in attenuating the risks of rivalry in deployment. And then once something starts, there will be rivalry, there will be accommodation, there will be confused attempts to develop governance after the fact.
And by the way, I know you touched on this before, saying that the physical risks wouldn't differ that much in these two different scenarios, but perhaps in a less cooperative scenario, you would have had less governance of what would be the right amount to, deploy and where and so on and so forth. Could you see increased physical risks on the actual physical level from the SAI deployment, or is it really primarily around the social and geopolitical side of things?
So you can get physical risks if you try to turn it up really fast, if you do it in a highly unbalanced way, or if you do it very strongly and then quickly turn it off and don't restart it. So those are scenarios where you can play out stories of rivalry and conflict that lead to those outcomes, but all of them are kind of limited. I think in almost every case, the more salient risks actually arise through political, social, and geopolitical mechanisms.
Cynthia, do you want to come in on some of what Ted raised around regional rivalries? Is there anything else you wanted to share about how you see some of those kind of scenarios playing out?
I think I'd like to focus on his point about potential security scenarios and how this might feed into those existing rivalries. There's a great deal of misunderstanding or simply lack of knowledge among security actors, and that goes everywhere from the UN Security Council, which has never been briefed on this topic, down to military planners. And there's far too much loose talk about SRM as a weapon, or defining it in that kind of narrow corridor. And I think all three of us would agree that the impacts and the implications of SRM could indeed have a security component to them, but there's also a much broader spectrum of implications there. But simply lack of knowledge about what to do. What is this beast? And you're in a crisis situation. No one has clear authority. Everyone's scrambling. I think confused decision-making, misinformed decision-making would be the consequence pretty much under any scenario I can imagine if it were in an adversarial position.
Holly, and I realize there's just so many hypotheticals here and so many different potential actors. It's quite hard to, but would you like to add any thoughts on beyond governments and militaries and so forth? What do you think civil society groups might be doing? What might be emerging in this kind of a situation? Would there be any power in civil society to think about and address this adversarial situation?
I mean, this really depends on all the other non-climate, non-SRM aspects of the scenario. I think that also part of that landscape, to Cynthia's point about, people not being briefed on this. I mean, are we going to be in a situation where people are turning to large language models to help them navigate emergent situations, and what sort of output are those models going to be given them? Can that play a coherent role, or is it going to make things worse? I think that's a really important question right now.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. I wonder, just before we go to the next section, Kerry, do we have the second poll, which was around when do you think SRM deployment? Here we go. So a quick question for the audience here. When, if ever, do you think SRM, and I guess in this case SAI deployment, could become a real possibility? By 2040, from 2040 to 2080, after 2080, or never? Thank you. So we give a couple of minutes for that. Well, less than a couple of minutes. What do we got? Okay, so a third of the audience thinks that by 2040 is a real possibility. Then close to half of the audience thinks that 2040 to 2080 is the real possibility. 5% after that, and never around 13%. So interesting to see that that's where people stand. So let's have a little conversation about limiting risk. Clearly, we've identified risks in both cooperative and non-cooperative scenarios. What kind of things should we be doing now, I guess, to make the better version of this more likely, as it were? Ted, perhaps you could give us some of your top-line thoughts. You started touching on this before in terms of what kind of governance needs to be built, but what measures should we be putting in place now to reduce the risks of bad forms of deployment?
Okay, first, it's been said thousands of times, but it needs to be said again. Finally get serious about international climate action on the other essential dimensions. I'm in a minority in being an optimist that more focused and concrete conversation about interventions might actually be helpful in moving to serious action on emission cuts, removals, and adaptation. But more narrowly related to interventions, first thing, reaffirming points both Holly and Cynthia have made, more research in more places in transparently managed, publicly funded programs in multiple countries, especially in the global south, with international coordination and cooperation over research. Hasn't happened, relatively easy, might be on the cusp of happening right now. Second, some vehicle for international assessment that can interpret the research, synthesize it in policy relevant terms, provide a forum for early conversation about needed governance structures. And then in terms of an early concrete agreement that might be feasible, I think there's great purchase in expanding cooperation on global atmospheric monitoring. It would serve multiple purposes. It could extend existing capabilities, but explicitly provide a capability which many states will want, and indeed some of the recent discourse from the American right has emphasized, to sort of know what others are doing and monitor closely enough that there's no possibility of, interventions that go undetected. I mean, they're easy to detect for those that have the capability, but the capability is not universally shared and globally trusted, and that would be a huge step forward and reduce risks.
Cynthia, what kind of education do you think policymakers are going to need now to help them deal with these forthcoming questions?
Yeah, I think it's education with policymakers as well as the public, and wholeheartedly agree that the best possible outcome in terms of risk aversion is increased political momentum on decarbonization, actually solving the problem instead of addressing a symptom, which is, of course, what SAI is. Culture drives politics in a lot of places, and if there's somehow a cultural push to have greater action on that mitigation agenda, I think that would be a risk mitigation exercise that was well worth investing in. Monitoring and detection, absolutely agree with Ted. We are actually hosting a second workshop on monitoring at the end of June. If anyone's interested, I can follow up with you. Largely based with European actors, but the idea is to establish trust, to build a certain level of collaboration and trust among a small group of partners, a coalition of the willing. That's a term being used a lot these days. So monitoring is important. With policymakers, I think both listening as well as learning is important. And ditto, for that matter, with the public. It's not just a unilateral sense of let us tell you what this is. It's really taking the time to listen. What are the concerns people have? What are the questions? And what are the values underneath those concerns and questions that are shaping this discussion?
So in your experience in Europe, and I know you've been doing a lot of this listening for, what are the kind of biggest things that are coming up right now that you're discovering that policymakers are concerned about, would like to know more about?
Yeah, who's doing what? Who's paying for it? How do we know if anyone is cheated? Those are three very common questions. The answer to all of those is we don't know right now, because we don't have a transparent global public registry or even an EU-wide one. Funding, SRM 360 has done a terrific job of pulling together available data, but there are still gaps, as we all know. Cheating, well, no one's doing it yet that we know of, so it's a question for the future, but that's where monitoring and detection might come in. And then, of course, risks. The emphasis is definitely on the risk side, the precautionary principle, the idea that there are definitely more risks than potential benefits, I would say, is the pervasive sentiment here. It may not be in other areas, but definitely in Europe, the conversation is focused on risk. And for good reason. I'm sorry, and one last one, moral hazard. Would using this make mitigation less successful?
And when you say the conversation is focused on risk, is that a risk sort of standalone, as it were, or an understanding that there's risks with SRM and risks of not deploying SRM, as it were? How much is that risk versus risk framework, as people in the field like to call it, getting through?
Not a whole lot, to be honest. At the moment, not a whole lot. It's usually looking at the physical side of risk in terms of SRM deployment, not at maybe geopolitical risk, although that security element is there. But yes, it's mainly focused on SRM. And when you try to say, well, we were also going to have grave risks under climate change, there is a nod, like definitely we understand that, but the mental focus, the emotional cue is on the risks of SRM.
Holly, you also mentioned investment and monitoring. I don't know if there's more you'd like to add on how you see that, and sort of more broadly, what kind of public information and other communication work do you think might be needed at this stage that could potentially contribute to some of the less risky versions of deployment emerging?
Yeah, so the first thing is we do have a situation with stratospheric monitoring satellites going dark. We have not been funding these capabilities and launching new satellites. So this is one dimension of the conversation. I don't want to leave it there, though. I think when people think of monitoring, that's kind of the first sort of things that they go to. But really, we need to be thinking about monitoring infrastructures as public communication work, we need to be thinking about how do we involve people and how these systems are built and make sure that they can use them too. The public is an active, client isn't the right word, but user isn't the right word either, maybe. People are interested in what's going on. You have open source analysts that love to track planes. You have people that like to run lab samples on their soil and water and learn more about it. We need a sort of architecture that can fuse all of this, make it accessible, that helps with legitimacy. I also want to give a shout out to a paper just published by Wake Smith and colleagues in Environmental Research Climate, which is called On the Detectability by Uninvolved Parties of Covert Stratospheric Aerosol Injection Programs Producing Transboundary Impacts. Quite a mouthful, but that paper makes a useful distinction between detection and monitoring. And then beyond that, there's also an educational piece. People need to understand the objectives of a program, its limitations, that SAI, for example, doesn't deal with things like ocean acidification, and also the consequences without this intervention. We can think about vaccine programs and how they were successful, but then people forgot about the horrors of measles and how do you keep, those counterfactuals in mind as a program advances.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to go to questions, but perhaps before we go to questions, Kerry, can we share the last poll that we have for the audience? Be interested in your thoughts. And if large-scale SAI were ever to be deployed, how likely would it be to go well in the first 10 years, in your view? Impossible, very unlikely, unlikely, likely, or very likely. So if we could give a few seconds for thoughts there. Let's see what level of optimism this audience has after having listened to the discussion. Right. I'd say that's a somewhat more even spread than I thought, but yeah, 40% on unlikely and another 40% are impossible or very unlikely. But there's 25% of the audience who think it's likely or very likely that a deployment could go well. So thank you so much for filling in those polls, and let's now turn to questions. So Linus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to the panelists for the great discussion. So on to some questions from our audience then, starting with one to Ted. How does discussing SAI academically affect the course of history? Admittedly, it's fun to engage in, but it seems irrelevant to the behavior of states. So I'm wondering if you can give your thoughts on the role of scientists in this discussion.
Well, sometimes government decision makers listen to scientists. Sometimes academic discussion frames issues that come up for public decision making. Sometimes people who do academic and research engagement move in and out of positions of government. I mean, moving the course of history is very big. It's very heavy. It's hard to move. I do not share the sentiment that getting your thinking straight about what we might do, what the risks are, and how it might help human welfare is somehow futile or frivolous.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Next, a question for Cynthia. What diplomatic efforts are already underway to help governments understand what the options might be? I suppose this is in relation to policymaking.
I can answer very succinctly in 2 words, too few. But beyond those 2 words, at the UN level, it's really been UNEP, the UN Environment Program, and also WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, that have been kind of tasked by the Secretary General to follow this issue. They've done 2 consultations maybe it's 2 years ago now, and UNEP has hired some experts. They did a report that came out in 2023, One Atmosphere, They just released another report in the last month that was heavily oriented again toward the risk side of the equation, I would say, on this. Let's see what also comes out of the new UNEP report on overshoot and how that affects the conversation. But honestly, if there were a crisis to be developing today, the UN, like almost any other government I could think of or collection of governments, is woefully unprepared. There is not a set of coordination actions that have already been agreed upon, a strategy, a kind of crisis group set up, a crisis communications group, which I think would be absolutely essential to this entire scenario that we're talking about. So I'll stick with my two-word answer, too few.
Thank you, Cynthia. Onto a question to Holly then. This one's from Gary Ford. How concerned would you be that this might be used as an excuse for delaying or avoiding taking action on the underlying causes of climate change and for tackling the impacts that this solution doesn't address? So we touched on moral hazard a bit earlier, but you got more to share there, Holly?
Yeah, I'm pretty concerned about this. And one thing I'll say about the literature on this, there's been a lot of studies about the public as kind of an object of moral hazard and, does it decrease their energy? I think those of us who work on this are much more concerned about elite actors and policymakers and their rationales rather than the public. And I think this is where we need to think about phase out as the frame rather than emissions reductions and think seriously about the geopolitical obstacles to phasing out fossil fuels. I think that this could definitely play a role in that discussion.
Thanks, Holly. Back to you then, Ted, for a question from Beth Chalecki. Why do you think a large multilateral international agreement on SRM governance can't be had, given that it could serve as a clearinghouse for scientific information and a diplomatic flag point for contentious deployments? Is it not worth pursuing?
Hi, Beth. I don't think I said an international agreement can't be had. I think I said that an authoritative international agreement controlling deployment or the terms of deployment in advance of deployment was unlikely. An agreement that includes a scientific clearinghouse, including the sort of monitoring arrangements that a couple of us have now discussed, I think is both desirable and feasible. And of course, agreements expand over time. People often think about clubs as a route toward broader multilateral agreements, so they start with a few participants and then grow to more. Agreements can also expand in scope over time if they're constructed with a flexible enough framework to begin with. So I actually have some hope that an agreement that will be centered on exchange of scientific information, assessment, and monitoring, if constructed with a suitable framework, could actually expand in that dimension and be more effective as a regulatory and kind of control and oversight body.
Thanks, Ted. Back to Cynthia for another question. This one's from Sumitra Das. Who should have the authority to decide whether SRM is deployed? Should this decision rest with the UN, a coalition of nations, vulnerable countries, major powers, scientific bodies, or some new international governance structure?
Hi, Sumitra. That is the question, I think, in so much of these discussions. First of all, it needs to reflect the issue of equity. Equity is central to any climate discussion, as is the issue of trust. And so the voices of climate vulnerable countries are absolutely critical to any kind of a decision, as are the voices of young people and considerations about the intergenerational aspect of this. In fact, I just came from a workshop where we had 13 youth organizations from the EU learning about SRM today and listening to their questions about this. But an agreement has to address both equity as well as effectiveness, meaning that those powers who have the capability to deploy are also part of this agreement. And that's where things get very complicated very quickly. Could there be an agreement that weaves together 195 nations, as there was in Paris? If I had to say now, I would be quite pessimistic about that possibility. So how do we balance those two key concerns, equity and effectiveness? I don't have an answer. It might be a polycentric kind of an arrangement where various different treaty bodies or different processes are brought together in some kind of coordination. Maybe WMO looks at monitoring, UNEP looks at impacts, the Security Council is briefed on potential conflicts. We're very far from that world right now, unfortunately.
Cynthia, I wondered if I could jump in on this because I'm interested, and I'd also love to hear from Holly and Ted on this. There's a lot of this is what these are good places this should be happening, but who would actually be driving that to happen in these places? Is this something that you could see a small nation, independent of superpowers, or a superpower, or the European Union? Who is likely to actually drive those governance processes in those bodies that right now, given the state of the world?
I can speak a bit to the EU. We're focused very much on governance of research. What does that look like? Why is publicly funded research more important? Because of issues of transparency and accountability. And there, I think middle powers, and I would put the EU in this category, have a role to play in terms of advancing something that right now no government really wants to talk about publicly. Behind closed doors, many are wringing their hands and wondering, oh my gosh, what's next? What do we do? So I do think there's a real opportunity for the UK as well as the EU to come forward on at least the governance of research. Governance of deployment is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Maybe I'll let other panelists chime in on that. I don't have an answer, just to be quite frank on that one.
Ted, Holly, love your thoughts on this one too.
Governments and intergovernmental bodies don't initiate action in difficult, controversial new areas without somebody pushing very hard. And notwithstanding inequalities of power and the presence of great powers in the world, it's surprising how often the initial pushers can be rather small. So it was astonishing to me the influence that AOSIS, the small island states and vulnerable states, had in moving at least the theoretical agenda of international climate talks. I mean, the 1.5 degree target came from them. We're not doing a very good job of getting there. So significant governance movement will come by vigorous, sustained, informed pushing. It could come from multiple orders, middle powers, coalitions of smaller nations. And it's easier to get concrete movement when there are clearly observable material conditions happening. So governance will get a lot more serious once somebody does something. And I more and more think that the likely temporal order of stuff is somebody does something, there's a quick governance response, and then there's a kind of an interaction and adaptation. And I used to think that was a perilous trajectory with all kinds of ways to go into terrible, global catastrophes. I now more and more think that's actually a trajectory that is more likely to lead to benign and maybe rational governance, than the alternatives.
Holly, could you see?
But I'm a temperamental optimist,
Holly, any further thoughts on that? Could you see the public in some ways driving this, or is the public not really a factor when governments are working together in the UN?
Well, I think behind what governments are doing, I agree with Ted completely, is that they don't move on controversial topics unless they're pushed. I think you can look at something like the history of carbon removal, where you had a handful of integrated assessment modelers kind of invent the concept. Then you had philanthropy take it literally and try to move it forward. And now you have kind of a nascent industry that sort of exists, but also doesn't have a policy regime for it to scale. It could be something analogous to this. For me, the big question is, okay, how does climate philanthropy approach this? And how does the profits that come in from AI and what those philanthropists are interested in over the next decade shape, what government agendas get done? And I'm not happy about that. It's a horrible situation. I think the public is already very critical of philanthropy, and will continue to be more so as the AI boom continues to be mismanaged. So I think that the techlash is going to really shape the dynamics here, and maybe we'll end up with a broader recognition that the public needs more say over emerging technologies. Like that could be one optimistic outcome.
Well, that's, thank you so much for your. We're on the hour now, so I'm just gonna wrap up the formal part of this session, but we have got up to 10, 15 minutes, depending on what time you guys have after the session, just to wrap up any questions. So please save your thoughts, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to Holly, Ted, and Cynthia. We really appreciate you taking part in this discussion. And thank you so much to everybody in our audience for putting in your questions, answering the polls. And we hope to see you next time. We really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter and definitely join the conversation on our LinkedIn page. We've got a weekly wrap up of news there and all sorts of interesting things coming out. So join in the conversation. And we'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate your time. And with that, we're now in overtime. So if you guys can hang on a couple more minutes, but if you need to leave at any time, that would be great. Linus, Cynthia, actually, I saw you wanted to come in on that last point.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Holly was saying. I like the terminology techlash. The thing that has directed more attention to this issue, I think, than anything else, at least in Brussels and surrounding capitals, is the entrance of the private sector. And I think the tape that goes through many policymakers' minds is, oh my gosh, is this a repeat of AI? Where the commercial sector comes in, maybe not through the front door, but they're a contractor, they come in through the side door. More and more money is poured into this. The money comes from sources that are non-transparent. Public funding in the EU doesn't match in any way the scale of what private money might be. And then we're off to the races. And so that conversation about what the influence of the private sector is on this conversation, I think is quite germane.
Thank you. Great. So I'll get to a last few questions from our audience then in this time that we've got. One from Tom Harris. I'll just paraphrase this one slightly and direct it to Holly. What influence could a strong El Nino have in the next year on deployment timescales and governance, considering potentially 1.7 degrees next year or over 2 degrees by the mid-2030s?
Yeah, I think that this could put climate back on the agenda. And I'm aware I'm speaking from a very US-centric viewpoint where we've had kind of a vibe shift with regards to climate and how much people want to focus on it, which is not necessarily the case in other countries. So I do think that the geography of those impacts would be important. But if it does reemerge on the agenda, which I think it will, it could create additional pressure for some sort of solution, whether that's SAI or more action on methane and short-lived climate pollutants. I'm not sure what it will look like, maybe attention to adaptation as well.
Thanks, Holly. Over to Ted then. Here's a question from Gregory Slater asking you to expand on your comment that capability is moving fast. And the question notes that the technology is where it was 50 years ago. So just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, that's not correct, that the technology is where it was 50 years ago. So there are now 3 or 4 plausible designs for ways to modify existing aircraft or develop new ones that could operate with full payloads in the stratosphere, some at mid to high latitudes, a couple, including one I just learned about a week ago, that could actually operate at low latitudes. It's been known that sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere are a big natural source and reflect sunlight for 50 years. So in that respect, knowledge has not changed, but the understanding of how to distribute them, fade and transport once they're up there, has advanced to an astonishing degree, such that I think it's fair to say at the moment that if there were a kind of a broad-based political decision that this was an important and worthwhile thing to do, there, suppose a magical world with a kind of a benevolent coalition of, 2 or 3 dozen powers worldwide, major powers, every major region represented, climate's an emergency. Yes, we're going to get serious on decarbonization. We're also going to do this. There would be no technical barriers to starting on a program toward deployment. There would be adjustments along the way, but more and more people actually understand and have the capability to do it.
Thanks, Ted. A couple questions have come in about climate catastrophes. So I guess some extreme weather events or something like that. So I'll pick Sumitra Das's here again for you, Cynthia. How seriously should we take a Ministry of the Future scenario, so from that book, where escalating climate disasters lead one nation or a coalition of vulnerable nations to deploy SRM because the international system fails to act fast enough?
That book has had quite a striking resonance with people who are making policy decisions or advising it. I've seen the book literally sitting on the desk of some very senior people. So let's not, again, understate the importance of culture in driving this conversation forward, whether that's for good or for ill or in misinformed ways. I believe Kim Stanley Robinson himself said last summer he was in India and he set the book in the 2040s, and he should have set it for the 2030s, if not today, given there was a massive heat wave there with lethal bulb temperatures. I do think that we are in a moment of great cognitive dissonance, putting ourselves at peril for not understanding really what is the trend leading us to, what is business usual, what does that look like? I'm hoping that the overshoot report that UNEP is putting out will sketch some of that out, not in depth like the 1.5 report done by the IPCC, but I do think there needs to be a real reality check among policymakers about the world that we are headed towards now. Our foot is on the accelerator, and that's quite scary.
Thanks, Cynthia. Following on from that, a related question to Holly. As has been said, a credible SAI governance structure depends on meaningful popular support. Do you agree that such popular support is unlikely in the absence of a dramatic climate catastrophe with a clear, irrefutable fingerprint of heat?
I mean, generally, it might not be one catastrophe. It might not involve heat. You could imagine a conversation about the limits of adaptation and people who successfully frame SRM as, the most accessible form of adaptation. I'm not arguing for that. I think there's problems with that framing, but that's something you can imagine. You can also imagine a conversation that's really about the impacts of tropospheric aerosol pollution and cleaning up that pollution and what happens when that warming is unmasked, and can that pollution be moved into the stratosphere? I'm also not recommending that line of argument, but you can see how these sorts of framings could pop up. And I think either of those framings in conjunction with some kind of damaging impact, whether that's a climate catastrophe or a water security issue, a food security issue, could put it more strongly on the agenda for the public.
Thanks, Ollie. I think with that, we're close to 10 minutes over time now, so we'll leave it there for the questions. But thank you very much to the audience for submitting those, and I'll hand back to Mark.
Brilliant. So I don't know if there's anything else that you guys would like to say as a sort of a final thought before we wrap up and really turn the machine off. It's 10 past. Cynthia, Ted, Holly, any other thoughts that you'd like to finish with?
No, thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and thanks for the opportunity to participate.
I might just echo what Ted said. I do think this conversation is moving very fast, much faster than even some of us who've been in this field for a while had predicted. And it behooves all of us to learn as much as we can and to ask questions and then to listen to people, especially people we don't necessarily agree with.
Yeah, thank you. It's really important to have a dialogue about these topics, and I appreciate how SRM 360 has put together this forum.
Well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.